Welcome back to the penultimate episode from my conversation with Lee Jussum, Distinguished Professor of Social Psychology and founding member of Heterodox Academy, a grassroots academic movement for free inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and the combating of unchecked ideological bias in academia. Like essentially all social psychologists, Lee is on the left. Unlike essentially all social psychologists, Lee is openly critical of woke ideology and its incursion into academia and society. In this part of the discussion, I ask Lee if the strong ideological skew within his field is suppressing valid lines of inquiry. I also ask what a more conservative-leaning social psychologist, if there was one, may do differently than their left-sided peers. When I was talking to my friend John Wilder, his big thing was vision, human and computer vision. And I asked him, is there anything that you feel any research issues are being suppressed in psychology? And he said that the biggest suppressing force is basically the idea. It's almost like a Thomas Kuhn kind of thing, where it's like it's like an intellectual conservatism. It is less risky to fund a study that is along an existing established path than to deviate. So the rewards are bigger, right, than the risks. And so for him, that's the biggest barrier, is when you deviate, it's not like a moral ideological thing. It's basically just right reasons. But he said, he's a vision scientist. That is apolitical. Your situation is very different. You've studied stereotype accuracy, so obviously it's not suppressing things altogether. But so two questions: are there any things that you could think of that are being suppressed in social psych? And secondly, related to the political polarization, if there were conservative social psychologists, I'm sure there are a few, and I really mean a few.
And you might think, well, it's all the right-wing psychologists. It's like all the right-wing psychologists are in this room, sitting in this chair.
What kinds of things would they study? And how would they study differently?
Well, I don't know if things would be fundamentally different, because to be in a field, you have to be trained in the ways of thinking, the methodologies, the sort of underlying philosophy of science, what constitutes an interesting research question, just like anybody else. So I don't know if it's that you might get some different things studied. You might, there might be more of a research emphasis on aspects of agency and individual sort of competence and sort of things like willpower, ability and willingness to sort of direct one's life the way one prefers, regardless of or to some degree independent of surrounding circumstances. But I think most of what you would get would be different kinds of questions. Like right-wing authoritarianism was being studied 70 years ago. It took most of those 70 years to discover left-wing authoritarianism. I think if the field was, 30 or 40% people on the right, it wouldn't have taken 70 years to discover left-wing authoritarianism. So I don't know the personal politics of the guys who study it, but regardless, even if they're all on the left, it just wouldn't, because if they are all on the left, it means it is possible to discover it even if you're on the left. I just don't think it would have taken 70 years.
Yeah, and another thing that I think it's this just occurred to me now is they might study the exact same thing but look at it from a totally different perspective. So for example, a more left-leaning social psychologist might look at things like tradition in terms of how they can go too far in the negative direction. They might look at children who were brought up by very religious or strict parents, and talk about the negative consequences of that. Whereas one on the right might look at, this person has predictability in their life. They have a sense of direction and purpose. They have a tight social network. They have clear values. So one might look at the costs and one might look at the benefits disproportionately of the exact same thing.
Well, yes, I think that's right. You talked about earlier in the very beginning of this discussion about hierarchies and, sort of the right being kind of hierarchical, the left being kind of anti-hierarchical. And most of the scholarship in the social sciences is anti-hierarchical. Now, as far as I can tell, I'm not a cross-cultural psychologist, so I'm now at the very outer limits of my actual expertise. But as far as I can tell, you have hierarchies in every human society. There's been no society with no hierarchical structure. There might be little small groups without much of one, but not any larger organization. So that makes a prima facie case for there being something of value, probably evolutionary value.
Tell us about the lobster.
Or has some evolutionary root to hierarchies. Hierarchies probably wouldn't be so pervasive if they didn't have benefits in addition to whatever their downsides may be. And my guess would be if there were more conservatives in the field, we would have a better and deeper understanding of the benefits of hierarchies rather than a sort of relentless parade of critiques of hierarchy.
And each side, as Peterson would say, well, what he used to say, it would balance each other out. The left would prevent the right from going too crazy, and the right would prevent the left from going too crazy. Right. They would counterbalance for each other, which would be a good thing.
Yeah. So I mean, as far as I can tell, most hierarchies are, when they're functional, everyone is getting something. The people at the low end are benefiting from something that is being produced in the hierarchy. Just consider an academic lab. You know, you have the PI on top. There might be postdoc or graduate students working with them. Then you have undergraduates and maybe a lab manager. So then you total hierarchical structure. Well, so what, are the people at the low end simply being exploited? Well, some people might say yes to that, actually. But in a functioning lab, what would be happening is the PI and the grad students will be helping the undergrads both develop skills, build their resume, and get into graduate school, professional school, medical school, law school. So they will be providing opportunities for the people at the low end to accomplish the things that they want to accomplish. That would be what's happening at that end. Because of who I am and how public I am about it, I sort of half joke that I've cornered the market on non-left students in social psychology.
I figured out how to monetize social justice warriors.
Right? Because it's like, where the hell are they going to go and not have to worry about, hiding who they are?
You're actually a safe space for them, like that.
I'm a safe space for them. I am. So this is the thing, because no one else. I have a diversity statement on my faculty page. It's a very conventional diversity statement, but it includes politics and religion. And so so when undergrads who are not full on with the whole progressive worldview come across my page, they're like, this is a breath of fresh air, and they often apply. And
I bet you've probably
they are so good. It's like, oh my God, they are just. This is like one of the best things I've ever done I didn't do it out of naked self-interest. I did it because it was the right thing to do. But if I had done it out of naked self-interest, it would have been one of the best things that I've ever done. Because the best of these students are coming into my lab, and they are good. And you asked earlier, like, how would things be different? They think differently. They come up with different questions. They raise different issues. Sometimes they study the same things differently, and sometimes they study different things. And it's just a pleasure to be working with these people. And then at my end, now I do, recently over the last 5 years or so, I would talk to them before they come, what do you want to do? I want to go into academia. Well, I know your background. You're here because of who I am. Academia, you're going to have to think long and hard about whether you actually want to go into academia. If you do, I will do everything I can to help you do that. But this is what you're facing. You need to go in with your eyes open.
You actually just perfectly set me up for the last thing I wanted to talk about. I think I read, are you a cyclist?
Yes, I was. It is my second thing after tennis.
So the reason is that this is going to be a metaphor for exactly what we're talking about here. Years ago, so one of my friends was a competitive cyclist and triathlete. And so during all the Lance Armstrong stuff, I remember the whole thing about how he was having certain members of his team purged because they were saying the wrong things about his PED use and such. Yeah. I asked my friend, I'm like, how can they just drop these other members of the team? Doesn't that basically necessarily entail a drop in the quality of the team? Because if the person they're replacing them with is better, they are at the spot. And what he told me was that basically, these weren't his exact words, but there's like a queen bee dynamic where the whole team revolves around the star, and it's almost like most of the rest of them, if not all of them, they're kind of like the drummer or the bass guitarist in a band. They're pretty replaceable. It's not super hard to replace them. That to me seems like a very good analogy to, let's say that you're a grad, like a postdoc or something, and you're applying for the next Rutgers tenure track position, and you're competing against 100 others, but you've got certain wrong opinions. It's like, well, they've got 99 other options with the right opinions, or at least they're hiding their wrong opinions. And so it's like, you're very disposable if you have the wrong opinions.
In the sense that in the sense that you just described it, that's absolutely true. I think that's
have to be a
absolutely
super
true.
overcome that.
That dynamic, though, really screws the field, because what it does is it effectively purges the field from people who would be more likely to discover and recognize ways in which the dominant claims and some of the dominant claims and conclusions, at least in political or politicized areas, are wrong, overstated, or underqualified.
Right.
And so that dynamic produces a skewed literature, which is one reason why the literature goes wrong. Even without, you don't need replication crisis for this. You can say, if it's sort of like the right-wing authoritarianism stuff. If you have 20 studies on implicit bias that make it look like implicit bias is a thing, and there are too few people to produce rigorous, vigorous critiques of it, then it's going to take 30 years to figure out the limitations to implicit bias. Whereas if you had people doing it from the get-go, it might have been realized, 5 years into the project.
It really is bad, because it's kind of culling the most important kind of diversity in a university setting, which is like different views.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly the most important with respect to political or politicized issues. That's certainly true.
And it's like,
for computational models of vision, probably not so much.
Right. And it's like, if the person with the wrong opinions is comparably good to a few other applicants, they're not going to get the job. Probably they have to be. It's almost like the old show House MD. He was such a dick, but he could get away with it because he was such a brilliant doctor. That it's like, if he was just an average doctor, he would have been fired. But it's because he's so good that they just put up with him. So it's like, you have to overcome it.
Yeah. That's the deal.
That does it for episode 4. In the next and final episode, I asked Lee if graduate level academic psychology is a Ponzi scheme. Subscribe and come back to see how Lee responds to my hot take on his field.